Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to Newspaper Review. I am Kasitoni, and I'll be taking you through the headlines. First, we'll start with the Daily Sun. Let's look at what's trending. We have really interesting stories here, boldly written on page 6 of the newspaper. Nigerian Labour Congress cry out over workers' worsening condition. They say high fuel price, unstable naira, inflation taking toll on workers, seeks government intervention. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 27, court affirms FCCPC powers to probe medical negligence. Then on page 4 of the newspaper, 6 out of 10 varsity students, Yahoo boys, EFCC chairman says. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on 28 of the newspaper, alleged $65,000 fraud. I don't have personal contact with contractors, says Senator King Jibe. Then on page 6 of the newspaper, Reps Deputy Speaker Kalu urged law school to dismiss petitions seeking withdrawal of his certificate. Then on page 26 of the newspaper as well, still at the bottom, Accord Party disowns Ibadan coalition, insists on fielding presidential candidate. Then on page 6 of the newspaper, 2027, our contest, win, says Tinubu, picks APC form. Moving away from that particular newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written on page 2 of the Matrix, outrage trails police extrajudicial killing in Delta. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 3, you continue reading. NCN adopts 10-year national policy on food nutrition for FEC ratification. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 23, my dad doesn't believe I'm an actor. That's coming from Uzo Arokwe, that's a Nollywood actor, says his father doesn't believe that he is an actor. You read that on page 23 of the newspaper. Tinubu's second term bid begins as Falake obtains 100 million naira forms. To get the full gist, you continue reading on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on page 8, ADC leadership tussle. Article films as party petitions CJN over delay in Supreme Court judgment. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Then on page 3 of the newspaper, cracks in APC over GAC's endorsement of Hamzat as Lagos State Governor. Moving away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph, boldly written on page 2, 5, and 6 of the newspaper. ADC writes CJN 6 expedited judgment on Supreme Court appeal. ADC writes CJN 6 expedited judgments on Supreme Court appeal. Then at the top of the newspaper, Q126, Nigerian exchange post 61.7% growth in turnover to 3.607 trillion naira. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. United Arab Emirates announces exit from OPEC plus amid Iran war tension. You get that on page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, New Telegraph, Akpabio declares Ondo South Senate seat vacant as Ibrahim resumes at UN. You get that on page 3 and 7 of the newspaper. Then in page 4 and 6 of the newspaper, reps to NCC extend SIM validity period to 18 months. Extend SIM validity period to 18 months. Still in the same newspaper, Kenyan president backtrack after comments mocking Nigerians' English. Kenya's president backtracks after comments mocking Nigerians' English. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 3, 5, 9, and 28, GAC adopts Hamzat at Lagos APC consensus urban candidate. Then on page 4 and 29 of the newspaper, Boko Haram threatens to execute 176 Kwara adoptees within 1 week. Still in the same newspaper, on page 6, Emefiele, how $6.23 million was fraudulently withdrawn from CBN, witnesses tells court. Emefiele, how $6.23 million was fraudulently withdrawn from CBN. Still in the same newspaper, on page 2 and 7, Obi meets Makinde, champions united, productive Nigeria. Obi meets Makinde, champions united, productive Nigeria. You continue reading that story on page 2 and page 7 of the newspaper. Moving away from that to The Hope, boldly written, Ondo operating full local government, judiciary autonomy. Ondo operating full local government, judiciary autonomy. And then at the top of the newspaper, Nigeria ranks among top hepatitis death nations. Nigeria ranks among top hepatitis death nations. That's coming from World Health Organization. Still in the same newspaper, Faleke picks presidential forms for Tinubu ahead of 2027 race. Still in the same newspaper, coming from the Labour Congress, 1 million naira salary useless without strong naira. 1 million naira salary useless without strong naira. At the bottom of the newspaper, court jails 397 years for kidnapping naval officer and others. Court jails 397 years for kidnapping naval officer and others. Ondo dissolved board for parastatals commissions. Ondo dissolves boards of parastatals commissions. Akpabio declares Ondo South seat vacant as Jimoh Ibrahim resumes at United Nations. Moving away from that newspaper to The Nation, boldly written on page 3 of the newspaper, Tinubu picks nomination form to open re-election bid. At the top of the newspaper, storm over Mark-led ADC, NWC's ultimatum to Supreme Court. You continue reading that full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom, Remi Tinubu commissions Zulum's nursing quarters, 2 mega schools. You find that on page 7 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, boldly written, experts point structural rot, graft in past sector collapse. Experts point structural rot, graft in past sector collapse. You see that on page 29 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, court affirms FCCPC powers to investigate medical negligence. You continue reading the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, reps okay $516.33 million loan for Sokoto Badagry Superhighway project. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 6, OAU orders 3-week mid-semester break amid student protest. OAU orders 3-week mid-semester break amid student protest. Get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Senate considers new bill to diversify police funding. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, small insurers race against time as recapitalization deadline looms. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to The Punch, boldly written, 2027, Tinubu APC, Bigwigs, peak form. AGC backs Hamzat. You get that on page 24 of the newspaper. Tinubu, APC, Bigwigs, peak forms. GAC backs Hamzat. At the top of the newspaper, federal government targets $3 billion share earnings with export banned. You get that on page 48 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, delayed Supreme Court judgment. Opposition fears election exclusion. ADC petition CJ end. You get that on page 34 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, presidency counters Northwest neglect claims. List ongoing projects. You get that on page 26 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, xenophobic protests escalate in South Africa. Locals target school children. You get that on page 36 of the newspaper. Neyman evacuates 12 children, 10 infants, 159 others from Libya. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom, US-Iran war. NNPC hikes oil price by $7 per barrel. You get that on page 49 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard, boldly written on page 5. ADC PRP blue hot. ADC PRP blue hot. At the top of the newspaper, 1 million salary worthless without stable naira. 1 million naira salary worthless without stable naira, coming from the Nigerian Labour Congress. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. Tinubu kicks off 2027 re-election bid as APC begins sale of forms. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. One Dangote is not enough. You get that on page 34 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, UAE quits OPEC May 1st, raises concern over market stability. UAE quits OPEC May 1st, raises concern over market stability. You get that on page 40 of the newspaper. Family recounts horrified killing of Abuja core member, demand justice. You get the full gist on page 7. Still in the same newspaper, family recounts horrific killing of Abuja core members, demands justice. Family recounts horrific killing of Abuja core member, demands justice. You get the full gist on page 7 of the newspaper. Away from that to the leadership newspaper, boldly written, how APC stopped governors from buying up nomination forms. How APC stopped governors from buying up nomination forms. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, regulatory clash threatens 400 billion naira telecom credit market. Operators warn. You get that on page 33 of the newspaper. Nigeria needs clear national strategy to harness emerging technologies. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, ADC lawyer writes Supreme Court seeks speedy judgment. You get the full story on page 37 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 4, Adamawa can worries over Boko Haram killing. Adamawa Christian Association of Nigeria worries over Boko Haram killing. Still in the same newspaper on page 7, 6 out of 10 varsity students involved in Yahoo. Away from that newspaper to the blueprint, boldly written, Tinubu begins re-election bid, picks APC nomination forms. You get the full gist on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, COVID-19 Senate charges NCDC on surveillance, testing, contact tracing. Senate charges NCDC on surveillance, testing, contact tracing. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Middle East war to spark biggest energy price surge in 4 years, coming from World Bank. You get the full story on page 20 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to The Guardian. Boldly written, opacity, weak audit trail federal government spending amid abuse of Fiscal Responsibility Act. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 3 at the top, court orders MTN, Airtel to resume airtime lending services. Court orders MTN, Airtel to resume airtime lending services. Still in the same newspaper on page 13, federal government moves against malnutrition. OK's 2026 to 2035 nutrition policy. Still in the same newspaper on page 5, SSANU to shut down varsity over stalled negotiation on Friday. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 4, EFCC probes VCs over inflated contract. Students' fee diversion. EFCC probe VCs over inflated contracts. Students' fee diversion. Then on page 30 of the newspaper, terrorists threaten to execute 176 Kwara adoptees. Then in page 7 of the newspaper, Rivers, stakeholders bemoan load in governance, multiple stalled projects. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, rebuilding the foundation of basic education, how the Tinubu administration is driving system-wide reform. You continue reading that on page 26 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. Boldly written, David Mark faction rights CJN appeals for speedy judgment delivery. On top of the newspaper, 1 million naira salary worthless without stable naira, says Nigerian Labour Congress. Still in the same newspaper, reps approved Tinubu's $516 million loan request, together on page 2 of the newspaper. National development, Sanusi urges universities to drive AI policy. You get it on page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, NESREA seals 30 Abuja construction site over environmental violations. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. $6.23 million was fraudulently taken from CBN coffers, says EFCC weaknesses. EFCC weakness says $6.23 million was fraudulently taken from central bank coffers. At the bottom of the newspaper, Nenani Usman emerges substantial Labour Party national chairman. You continue reading that on page 4 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Kasitoni. Do well to stay engaged for more updates. Do have a beautiful day. Bye for now.